on, children, you're acting like children. Every generation thinks it's the end of the world.
Good morning, students. It's nice to be talking with you today. I'm sitting down for this lecture because the video camera that I had procured, I lost. I've never lectured sitting down in my entire life, but I will do my best. And if you are patient with me, I don't have to be patient with you because I can't see you. There it is. Today we're going to be talking about the forgotten war. It's forgotten and we want to forget it. First thing I want you to remember, we don't like the Korean War. Why don't we like the Korean War? Firstly, we did not achieve total victory. In most of our wars, it's very clear where we achieved victory. World War II was very decisive. And so the Korean War is one of those wars where we do not win a decisive victory. The Vietnam War, of course, later echoes the Korean War itself. So we want to forget it. Another reason we want to forget this war is the fact that 54,000 Americans died in this conflict in order to essentially keep the status quo, and we'll be talking about that. But first and foremost, I think it's important to recognize that this war is fundamental in helping to establish how far the United States will go in her containment policy. So we'll be talking just today about the origins of the conflict, the basic initial movement within the conflict, and talking a little bit about the long-lasting political and military ramifications of the conflict. Before we go any further, I want to ask you if you know who these two men are. The man on the left, the man on the right. It should be very obvious who they are. The man on the left is the president, Harry Truman, and the man on the right, if you don't know, figure it out. Okay, we want to forget this war. Once again, 54,000 dead Americans, and we didn't win total victory, but it had a very, very important, long-lasting impact on foreign policy. Vietnam, of course, is going to be based essentially on the same sort of setup as the Korean situation. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the origins of this particular conflict. The end of World War II, the United States and our ally, the Soviet Union, of course, found that we were not in as much agreement as we had hoped. We realized that the Japanese occupied territories, Korea being one of those, were up for discussion in terms of the extent that our influence and the Soviet influence would affect those various regions. Once Korea was finally liberated from Japan, if you remember back in 1910, the Japanese took over Korea and had basically held Korea as a colony clear until the end of World War II. The end of the war, we helped to install a leader in South Korea. There was a divide in 1948 in some sort of I wouldn't say really an agreement, but a mutual understanding that the United States and the democratic capitalistic countries would have influence in the South, and so the United Nations is going to take a great deal of interest in what happens in South Korea. Meanwhile, in the North, there is a dictator that is installed by the communists. Kim Il-sung is the leader in the North, and Syngman Rhee is the leader in the South. Kim Il-sung is also the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea. This divide took place in 1948. Keep in mind, this is a very contentious time period in Soviet-American relations. The Cold War had just begun a few years previously. Our former allies were now our enemies. We found that Joseph Stalin was not the good, kind Uncle Joe that we believed that he was. And in fact, communism had spread through all of Eastern Europe. As Winston Churchill said, there was an iron curtain descending across Europe. We had installed the Marshall Plan, which was based largely on our experience in Turkey and Greece, where we brought a tremendous amount of finances, resources, as well as some military aid to the countries, the legitimate governments of Turkey and Greece. And this, of course, is largely called the Truman Doctrine at the time, and later that turns into the Marshall Plan. And this is fundamental to understanding the doctrine of containment. How do we keep communism from expanding? Also, we have China falling to communism. Mao Zedong pushes the legitimate leader, Chiang Kai-shek, off the mainland, and to this very day, the United States recognizes Taiwan as the legitimate government in China. And so this whole situation is a very tense one. Additionally, the Soviet Union knows that we have developed the atomic bomb, obviously, after dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki. The Russians may have believed that we were a potential threat with those sorts of weapons. And indeed, we could have used those weapons on the Soviet Union if it came to that. And so the Soviet Union is going to be expanding their research, their efforts in developing their own atomic weapons in the later 1940s. The question I'm going to be asking here today: who is responsible for this conflict? Was it the communists, North Korea, or perhaps, as some historians, American historians, have suggested, that it was actually the Americans' fault for causing this conflict? So let's talk a little bit about this conflict and who was responsible. After all, the North did invade the South, as we can see, and we will see when I show you the maps of the way that the North invades very quickly, and much to the surprise of South Korea, and nearly takes over the entire peninsula. But perhaps it was the South that was at fault because it provoked the attack. After all, Syngman Rhee was quite known for making ridiculous and aggressive noises to his counterparts in the North. So whose fault was it? Well, rather than giving you the answer right up front, or what I'm going to argue right up front here, let's see how the history of this all plays out, and then I think my argument will become fairly obvious. So let's look at what Stalin's role was in all of this. We will see that Stalin has a very, very essential role in the cause of this conflict. Kim Il-sung of the North gives Stalin a call and asks Stalin if he can have the permission to basically invade South Korea. So right there, the North seems pretty aggressive. Of course, Kim Il-sung knows where the bread is buttered, and that's, of course, from Moscow, so he has to have Stalin's permission. Turns out our own American Secretary of State, who you'll see on the left side of your screen, his name was Dean Acheson, he made a rather large blunder when he was discussing the reality that Americans did not intend to extend the Marshall Plan or especially military aid or support to areas of the world that we did not consider to be essential to American interests. And so, of course, Korea is one of those places where, frankly, we didn't have much interest in Korea. Not a lot of natural resources, not a huge population, and it's also not a population that was strategically connected to any other areas of the world that were actually strategic. And so when Acheson made this statement very publicly, it gave the North Koreans extra incentive to wish to invade South Korea. After asking Stalin, Stalin says, "I'm good with it, but I'm not going to support you militarily because I do not, firstly, want the financial drain." He didn't explain that. He didn't want the financial drain, and largely also did not want to be fighting directly with the United States. And so what does he do? He says, well, you need to call up Mao in China, and Mao needs to support you, say that he will, in case of a disaster, support you militarily. Before that, though, Stalin talks to Mao and says, I want you to support North Korea. I'm not going to support them, but you are going to support them. And so Mao listens to what Stalin basically suggests. Stalin twists Mao's arm a bit. And so then Mao gives his guarantee that if there are any major difficulties in the fighting, for instance, if it goes badly for North Korea, that he will step in militarily. To put it very directly, the Korean War would not have occurred without Joseph Stalin insisting that Mao support Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans. And so, yes, my argument is that the war was caused by communist aggression, not by the Americans or by the United Nations. And so ultimately, what does this look like with Mao's arm being twisted by Stalin? In June of 1950, we see that the North Koreans are very, very successful. The South Koreans are taken completely by surprise. Their capital is very near to the 38th parallel. And so when the North Koreans come storming in, the South Koreans have nothing to do except for to relent, and many of them do, or those who were a part of the South Korean army and government, they fled south, and they fled south to the corner of the boot of the peninsula. It was called Pusan, and there they set up kind of pathetic lines of defense to try to keep the North Koreans from pushing them completely off the peninsula. And so Truman has a decision to make. Does Truman engage with these communist aggressors, or does he simply abandon the entire enterprise, have our few troops that are stationed nearby in Japan and the few that were on the ground in Korea basically just give up and let the communists take over? And Truman makes a decision. He decides that the Americans who are trained primarily in a peacekeeping mission in Japan are going to be sent over to Korea, land on the corner of the boot there in Pusan, and to help strengthen the lines of defenses against the North Korean attack, while the UN then readies an attack on the North Koreans. And this is where Douglas MacArthur is ultimately going to be very important for the Americans. The Americans were poorly equipped, they were poorly trained, and they were embarrassing on the battlefield. It's a story we've heard before. Gradually, UN forces arrive and shore up the line of defense and hold it fairly strongly. And so now all of a sudden, it looks like Kim Il-sung has gambled badly, right? Dean Acheson had made the comment that Americans were not interested in places like Korea, and all of a sudden here the Americans and the UN show up. Does this mean that China's automatically going to become involved? Not yet. Hold on, that's coming. After the UN troops begin to gradually arrive, they shore up a very strong defense along those lines, keeping the South Koreans safe in Pusan. Meanwhile, Douglas MacArthur, who you see just to the right of Harry Truman, comes up with a remarkably astonishing plan. He is going to use an amphibious landing, which is very difficult. He's going to land American and UN troops in the place with the second largest tide differentiation in the entire world, which is very risky, and he's going to catch the North Koreans by surprise. Even MacArthur's closest aides believe that this was a very bad plan. Let's look and see how this worked out. Before we do, really quickly though, you'll note how things were in 1950 in June, before the invasion of South Korea. You'll see that the 38th parallel is the dividing point between North and South. But notice how badly the South Koreans do in just a matter of 2 months. The North Koreans come into the South, almost push the South Koreans off the boot of Korea, and it's there in the right lower corner of the peninsula where the UN troops really help to shore up those lines to keep the North Koreans from completely pushing the non-communists off of the peninsula. Now this is where it could get interesting, and I'm going to try to use this tool, which I'm not very good at using. I think it's kind of a garbage tool. That's the reason. I'm going to blame it, not me. But we're going to say, to show you what the plan here is, it's really pretty surprising. So if you notice here, my little pen, all this area here in the red, South Korea, there's a mountain range that kind of runs up the middle of the peninsula. And what Douglas MacArthur wants to do is attack here, very close to the original border, and then move this way very quickly, cutting off the escape of the North Koreans as they are fleeing back to the north. He doesn't quite cut them off, but the landing is such a surprise. And then the UN pours it on with all that they have. And of course, the United States is leading the way. And so let's look here at the what this looks like by December of that same year. You can see the allies, the UN, has all the area in green, and they're verging on China. In fact, if you note right here, the American forces right here on the front lines can actually look across and see China proper. And Douglas MacArthur wanted a war with the Chinese. He wanted to drop some nukes on them. Harry Truman considered this to be not appropriate. And of course, the reasons for this is because it might turn into a mutually assured destruction sort of a scenario. We knew that the Russians were a threat to us. If we were to wind up in direct conflict with the Chinese, Russia might not be too far behind that. Okay, so you can see after this, in January 1951, something happens. You note that all of a sudden the lines change again very dramatically. And the rest of the war from 1951 clear until the end of the conflict in July of 1953, you'll note that the lines don't change a whole bunch. They just kind of go back and forth around the 38th parallel, bulging here or there just a little bit. And the war just sort of randomly ends. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. And once again, the reason why will go straight towards my argument as to why the Russians are actually behind this whole thing, believe it or not. So who ends the war? Well, Eisenhower says when he's running for president, I will go to Korea. That's his promise. I will go to Korea. And then everyone's like, well, when Eisenhower goes someplace, then you know that it's going to work out in our favor. And he does. He goes to Korea, and then the war's over. There's our lecture on Korea. Hopefully that was short enough for you.